for tuning in to today's episode of TPR Live. Today we're going to be talking about misplaced modifiers and some other kinds of modifiers that commonly cause issues for writers and test takers. So before we get started, as we always do, we're going to begin with our warm-up. So grab something to write with, something to write on, label your paper 1 through 4, and today you are going to determine which of these 4 sentences contain errors. At least one of them does, I won't say how many. And if you've spotted an error, see if you can determine what kind of error it is and maybe a way that you could fix the sentence to improve it. So we'll come back to these at the end, but I'm just going to quickly review them, read them aloud for everybody. So number 1 says, having purchased the stamp, the letter was finally ready to be mailed. Number 2, Rosalind almost spent $600 on Black Friday. Number 3, after working in the yard for many hours, Patel's socks were drenched in sweat. And number 4, covered in dust after sitting in the attic for months, the suitcase looked much older than it was. Okay, so I'll give you a couple more seconds there to write down what you need to, and we will come back to this very same slide at the end, and we'll review the correct answers. So let's go ahead and talk about modifiers. So what even is a modifier? Well, it's pretty simple. A modifier is a word or group of words that describe something, some other words, or something else in the sentence. So a one-word modifier could be an adjective or an adverb. You've probably heard of them and most likely don't struggle too much with those kind of smaller, one-word, shorter modifiers. But when it comes to a phrase or a clause and lots of words that are describing something else, things can get a little bit tricky. And the more complex the sentence is, the more room for error you'll find. So today we're going to be talking about 3 types of modifiers, call them modifier woes, with which people tend to have pretty big amount of trouble. So first is the misplaced modifiers, and then we've got a sort of subfield misplaced modifier called the squinting modifier. And lastly, we have the dangling modifier. So we're going to go through all 3 of these types with some examples of each, and if you're tuned into the live stream, feel free to type your questions in the chat box as I go. So, misplaced modifier. What is a misplaced modifier? You've likely heard the term. It's one of those things that it's maybe you kind of sort of understand what it is, but it's so funky and complicated that it's just never clear. So it's just a word, phrase, clause that it's in the wrong part of the sentence. So it's there, but it's not near where it needs to be because it seems to be modifying the wrong thing. And one of the problems with these modifier issues is that we're smart people, so when there's a grammatical error, our brains tend to understand what the writer or speaker meant, and we don't catch the actual error. So let's look at an example. Sheila baked a cake for Sherman with delicious icing. All right, so we've got Sheila baking a cake for Sherman, delicious icing. If you listen to how that sounds, it sounds fine, right? Sure, you understand that there's a cake and Sheila baked it, it's for Sherman. But what if you ask yourself, what's the modifying word, phrase, or clause? So what's the thing in this sentence that's describing something else? In this case, the only modifying phrase is this with delicious icing. All right, cool. So now ask yourself, well, who or what is being modified? Who or what has the delicious icing? Most likely, it's the cake that has the delicious icing, right? The cake, but looking at this next question here, where should we move this modifying phrase? Where it is right now, it's saying Sherman with delicious icing, but that's not what the writer would mean here. So we would need to move the phrase with delicious icing closer to cake to make it clear that that's what's being modified. So when you're dealing with a misplaced modifier, it is what it sounds like. The modifier has been misplaced. You simply need to move it. So for this sentence, you could rewrite it as, down here, Sheila baked a cake with delicious icing for Sherman. And it's that simple. But you really need to break it down and ask yourself, what's the modifying thing? And is that modifying word, phrase, clause, is it close to the thing being modified? So now we can see another example. In this sentence, Leo brought the bike to the shop, which had a rusty chain. Okay, so let's think about this. There's a bike, there's a shop, there's a rusty chain. Okay, most likely you understand what the intended meaning is here, but let's break it down. What is the modifying word, phrase, or clause? In this case, we have which had a rusty chain. And what is that modifying? Which had a rusty chain? This is modifying the bike. So we can ask ourselves, well, where should we move this phrase? As it is now, it looks like the shop has a rusty chain, but clearly that's not what's intended. So we can rewrite this as Leo brought the bike, which had a rusty chain, to the shop. Now it makes sense. It's clear what had the rusty chain. There's no room for ambiguity or any kind of confusion. Okay, and I see a question. So modifiers typically prepositional phrases. Many times you will see prepositional phrases like we saw on let me go back to it, the last slide. So we saw with delicious icing, that's one type. As you saw in this next one, we have the word which is beginning the clause, and that is not a preposition. So there are different things, but definitely watch out for prepositions, watch out for words like which or that, watch out for participles, which we'll see in a moment are more common with the dangling modifiers. But there are lots of different words or groups of words or even single words that can make up these kind of modifying phrases and cause these kind of errors. So then we have the squinting modifier. Sometimes this is grouped under the frame of, of a misplaced modifier because it has to do with placement. So a squinting modifier, you might hear it called an ambiguous or a two-way modifier. Basically, it causes uncertainty because it can actually be modifying two different things in the sentence, and either of them might make sense. So you're kind of like, you're squinting like, wait, what is this person trying to say? So check it out. Drinking coffee infrequently makes him feel well. First glance, it seems fine, right? But this could mean a few things. So does it mean when he drinks coffee infrequently, as in when there are very few instances during which he's drinking coffee, that makes him feel well? Or when he drinks coffee, as in the action of drinking coffee, he feels well infrequently. So you see how these have two different meanings. So depending on what it was that you were trying to say, you would need to manipulate your sentence and move things around to make it more clear. So another example, Sharon told me today she'll buy the book. Fair enough, great, Sharon's reading, happy for her. But what does she actually mean? Is it that today, when I spoke with Sharon today, she told me she would buy the book? In which case, I don't know when she's gonna buy the book, I just know she's gonna buy the book. Or does it mean Sharon told me she'll buy the book today? She's gonna buy it today. So you see how there's a little bit of ambiguity in both of these examples. And you might have also noticed that in this case, in both sentences, we've got adverbs that are our misplaced modifiers, right? We have infrequently in the first one and today. So those are describing the when or the how. There are other things that can serve as squinting modifiers, but it tends to be more commonly that you'll see an adverb without any kind of punctuation. Because if you have an introductory clause and a comma, for example, in this sentence here, today, comma, that's clear that we're talking about this day, as in now. Okay. So the last kind is a dangling modifier. And a lot of times dangling modifiers are incorrectly called misplaced modifiers. They're similar, but the difference is that unlike the first kind of modifiers we saw, the misplaced and squinting, a dangling modifier describes something that's not actually mentioned in that sentence. So it's a modifier problem. All three of these are modifier problems. If you're thinking about the SAT or ACT, you're not going to be tested on if you know what kind of modifier it is, so don't get too hung up on the names. Just know how to identify and correct them. So let's look at a dangling modifier. Gazing out the window, the potted flower looked nice. All right, well, the meaning is pretty clear, right? Someone's looking out the window, there's a potted flower, this someone thinks it looks nice. However, who's the someone? We don't know who's looking out the window. And technically, what this sentence actually says is that the potted flower was gazing out the window. Well, in the real world, that can't happen, right? Maybe in a movie, but not in real life. So this is why it's dangling. We need to figure out who is looking out the window. So in these cases, when you're dealing with them, again, just like we did with the other modifiers, what's the modifying word, phrase, or clause? This is going to be gazing out the window. And this is a participle. So Mickey, you had asked about prepositional phrases. So you've got a present participle here, gazing. It's just an ing form of the verb. So you identify the word, phrase, clause, ask yourself what's being modified. Well, who or what is gazing out the window? We don't know in this case. So it's not mentioned in the sentence. So what you have to do when you have a dangling modifier is you actually have to rewrite all or part of the sentence because you just can't move things around. In a misplaced modifier situation, you can shift things so that the phrase or words is next to the thing it's modifying. In this case, we don't have a thing mentioned, so we literally have to rewrite it. So one way to rewrite the sentence would be, gazing out the window, I admired the potted flower. Okay, so now I is here and I am gazing out the window. That works. So with dangling modifiers, a lot of times what you'll see is some ing or ed participle, so present or past participle, something, 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 comma, and then a noun. Well, the thing that comes right after that comma, the noun, should be the thing that's doing the action or being described here. So another way to write this sentence would be, I admired the potted flower as I gazed out the window. So it's slightly different, right? There are lots of different ways to rewrite sentences, but you just want to make sure that your modifiers are in the right place and that the thing that they're modifying is actually present. So another one, example of a dangling modifier here. We've got, while texting my mom, the doorbell rang. Okay, pretty clear what the meaning is, right? Someone's texting mom and the doorbell rings or rang. But there's a problem. So let's start here. What's the modifying word, phrase, or clause? Here we've got while texting my mom. Something that was going on. And who or what is being modified? Well, the way the sentence is written now says that while the doorbell was texting my mom, because the doorbell is coming after the comma. That's not right. But do we know who's texting my mom? Is there an I in that sentence anywhere? There's the possessive adjective my, but it doesn't actually say I anywhere in that sentence. So the thing being modified is not directly stated. So that just means that you've got to go ahead and rewrite the sentence. So a few ways you could rewrite it would be, the doorbell rang while I was texting my mom. There we go, we've got I. Most of the words are the same. We just had to add something and move things around a little bit. But now it's clear, there's no goofy errors here about doorbells sending text messages to mom. And then another way, while texting my mom, I heard the doorbell ring. So in this case, the modifying phrase is the same, while texting my mom, but we added an I, and there's a T there that should be lowercase, so pretend that that's lowercase. But you see there's a couple of words added in, but it's mostly the same. So there's lots of different renditions of these things that you can write. Again, make sure to modify the right thing, put it in the right place. And if anyone has questions, feel free to type them in. We're going to look at a few more examples of how you might see these modifiers tested in the real world, in real life. For instance, on the ACT or the SAT, it's pretty common to see these things tested on those tests, and you might see all or part of the sentence underlined when you're changing things. So let's look at a few examples a la ACT, SAT, so in this kind of style. So you might see something that says something like this. After playing outdoors all day, the snack was appreciated. When you read it, you're like, yeah, when I play outside all day, I like a snack too. Got it. I totally agree with that. But then when you break it down grammatically, remember you're taking a test, or if you're proofing your own essay, or if you're reading some other work, you want to be nitpicky, so break it down. Okay, so is something being modified? That's what you can ask yourself first. Is something being modified? And what is the thing being modified? So I'm not going to go through all the steps here. I'm going to show you the answers and let you guys kind of take a moment to work through what the correct answer could be. And as you're doing that, just think about all the things that I've been saying in regard to, you have the introductory clause, you've got a comma, and the thing after the comma needs to be the thing being modified by that phrase or clause at the beginning. So if we said, after playing outdoors all day, the snack. Maybe you have the answer by now, so we'll go through it. The snack was appreciated. So was the snack playing outdoors all day? Probably not. So guess what that means? We can cross off A and B because they both have the snack first. Now, C and D have the child. That makes sense, right? The child was playing outdoors all day. Probably the child had the snack. But between C and D, which is better? After playing outdoors all day, the child appreciated the snack, or the child was having appreciation for the snack. Well, if you're going for either of these tests, you know that concision is another layer of the right answer. So since both are technically grammatically correct, even though D is really funky, it's going to be C because it is more precise and more on point. So try the next one here on your own. As you go through this, think about everything that I've said and what you can cross out. So the whole thing is underlined. And the beginning for the no change says, walking along the beach, my flip-flop broke. Walking along the beach, my flip-flop wasn't walking. So I can get rid of A. And B is kind of doing the same thing while walking along the beach. We just added the while. So that's going to be out as well. And then C, I was walking along the beach, my flip-flop broke. Oh, it sounds fine. At least I'm in there. But we have a comma splice because I was walking along the beach, my flip-flop broke, both complete ideas. You cannot separate with them in a comma. That's another topic for another day. But for those reasons, it's out. Leaving D is the only option, so let's just check it. My flip-flop broke while I was walking along the beach. Yes, that totally checks out, and that's going to be your correct answer. So again, these are just a couple of ways that you might see modifiers tested on the ACT, SAT. Again, you're not going to need to know what type it is, but you want to be able to identify that, yes, I have a modifier issue, or maybe it's underlined and it's a no change. Don't be afraid to pick no change because a lot of the times you're going to have, they'll kind of mess with you because a certain amount of time, no change is correct. The same frequency with which you have B is correct, so is A and C and D. So do not be afraid to pick no change, but do go through the motions and ask yourself the questions needed to make sure you know that your modifier is in the right place, or that it's the thing being modified is actually present. So here are a few more for you guys, whoever is here in the audience, to go ahead and go through. So for these couple of sentences, what you're going to do is find the error, determine if it's misplaced, squinting, or dangling, and then try to rewrite each sentence. So the first one, Eileen made a cabinet for Jocelyn with glass doors. And all of these have errors in them. So what is the problem with this sentence? What's the modifier? This one, with glass doors, is the modifier. Well, currently, Jocelyn is with glass doors. Unless Jocelyn is a cabinet herself, she's probably not going to have glass doors. So what you would need to do to fix this one is you would say Eileen made a cabinet with glass doors for Jocelyn. Now there's no problem of ambiguity. And what kind of error is this? We just move things around. There was no kind of ambiguity, so it's just a misplaced modifier. Number 2, squinting to read the departure information on the screen as he ran toward the gate, Omar's phone fell onto the ground. That's a mouthful. That's like something you would see on one of those standardized tests. Lots of words, lots of things to throw you off and then make you reread the sentence, wasting a bunch of time because there's so much going on. So break it down. What is the modifier? Well, we see an ing thing here. So there's a present participle. Squinting to blah, 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 blah as he ran toward the gate. Okay. Omar's phone. Was Omar's phone squinting to read the departure information? Probably not. It's probably Omar himself that was running and kind of, oh my gosh, I'm running late for my flight, and then his phone fell out of his hand. You probably got that, right? The meaning was clear, but how do we fix this grammatically? We need to either move it or add something. So is there a way that we can move this whole squinting to read the departure information on the screen as he ran toward his gate? Can we move it to simply fix the sentence? In this case, we can't, right? Because there's no instance of just Omar. Omar's phone, Omar is describing phone. So it would have to be reworded. So it could be something like, squinting to read the departure information on the screen as he ran toward the gate, Omar dropped his phone onto the ground. And that's it. So very, very similar. This is why you've got to scrutinize and really look at the text. If you're revising an essay for school or for whatever, maybe you're doing college applications, like really look for these kind of errors. Next one here, and this number 2 would be a dangling modifier because we had to add a word since Omar was not mentioned. Number 3, despite her outstanding resume, the recruiter never contacted Kai. Okay, what's the modifier? We've got despite her outstanding resume. Probably know what's going on here. Poor Kai didn't get a call from the resume, even though, she didn't get a call from the recruiter, even though the resume was amazing. But the way it's written now, it looks like the recruiter had this outstanding resume and never contacted Kai. But in this context, if we know anything about recruiting and resumes, the recruiter's not applying for jobs, the recruiter's recruiting people to hire for other jobs. So ask yourself, can we move this thing despite her outstanding resume? And the answer for this one is yes. We could say the recruiter never contacted Kai, comma, despite her outstanding resume, and then it's clear that the resume belongs to Kai. All right, number 4. Famished and feeling a bit lightheaded, the pizza hit the spot. So what's the modifier? Here we have famished and feeling a little bit lightheaded. So as it's written now, it says that the pizza was famished and feeling a little bit lightheaded. Probably not the case. Whoever ate the pizza was feeling famished and a little bit lightheaded. In this context, we don't know who that is. If you were taking a standardized test, you would have a paragraph, at least something before or after to give you context as to who was feeling famished and a bit lightheaded. But since we have no context, we really can't fix this. It could be famished and feeling a bit lightheaded. My friend devoured the pizza. You know, there's so many different possibilities with this one. And this is just an example of why it's so important to be grammatically correct and also to provide context. So number 3 was a misplaced modifier. Let me label these for you all. So you have this written down. So this is misplaced, dangling for number 2. Number 1 was misplaced, and number 4 is a dangling. So we'll look at one more before we go to the cool down. And as we wind down here, it's the time to type in any last questions that you guys have. So number 5, oozing raspberry jelly, Aunt Min devoured the donut. Okay, What's the modifier? Oozing raspberry jelly. Well, as it's written, Aunt Min is oozing raspberry jelly. That is just probably not possible. So what do we need to do here? Do we know what is oozing raspberry jelly? The only other thing in the sentence is the donut, so probably it's the donut. So we could reword this and say, Aunt Min devoured the donut, comma, oozing raspberry jelly. Sounds a little bit funny to me. I personally wouldn't write that, but you could do something like, Aunt Min devoured the donut, comma, which was oozing raspberry jelly, or which is, or which will, whatever tense you're using. So you can add the comma which, and then the modifier. So again, there's lots of different ways to rewrite. You can rewrite all of these sentences in different ways because language is the thing that you can manipulate and say the same thing in different words, but just make sure your modifiers are in the right place. Okay, so finally, let's go to our cool down. We're gonna go revisit those 4 sentences that we saw at the beginning of today's presentation. So go back to your paper and check. So number 1, having purchased a stamp, the letter was finally ready to be mailed. Is there a problem with that? And the answer is yes, there is a problem. What's our modifier? Having purchased a stamp. And who or what finally purchased the stamp? Oh wait, we don't know. We don't know who purchased the stamp because it doesn't say. So this is gonna be a dangling modifier. And the letter was finally ready to be mailed. So having finally purchased the stamp, I was finally ready to mail the letter. Having purchased a stamp, my mom could send the letter. So you're gonna have to reword this, and there's no context, so there's a million trillion possibilities here. So number 2, and I will change my color here. So number 1 is wrong. Number 2, Rosalind spent almost $600 on Black Friday. Can anyone determine what the issue is in the sentence? Technically, grammatically, it's fine, but this is one thing we talked about a little while ago, that squinting modifier. So 2 could mean one of 2 things. Rosalind almost spent $600, like she was about to, but then her credit card was declined, or she decided not to. That's one meaning. She almost did, but she didn't. Or you could say she spent almost $600, as in she spent $599. It was almost 600 bucks. So this is the squinting modifier, and you would definitely want to make it clear which meaning you were going for if you were the person writing the sentence. And I see a question here. So since the test is time, do you have any tips we can use to help us manage our time better while answering these? So one thing that you want to do is notice, hey, I have a modifier situation going on. It's either going to be the introductory clause at the beginning of the sentence will be underlined, or the main clause will be underlined, or the whole thing. So when you're looking at your different types of questions, usually you'll look at the answer choices and you can see, like, do I have a lot of words that are changing in the answer choices? That means you're probably dealing with a modifier. Whereas if you're just dealing with tense, you might see something like is, were, will be, and you know it's a tense question, it's just a few words. So the first thing you do is identify, hey, I have a modifier. And then as you realize, yes, it's a modifier, ask yourself these questions that I've been asking. So what's being modified? What's the modifier? What's being modified? Is it in the right place? And how can I get it to the right place or reword it? Let me know if that makes sense. But kind of going through it systematically will help you to navigate that and not spend too much time on those kind of questions. Okay, and then number 3. After working in the yard for many hours, Patel's socks were drenched in sweat. So Patel's socks, I would hire them to come work in my yard, apparently. They'd like to work. But no, that's not going to work, right? Because Patel's socks weren't working. Patel was the person working. And his socks were drenched in sweat, but that's not what this says. It says that his socks were working in the yard for many hours. Okay, so how can we fix this? What's the modifier? After working in the yard for many hours. And this is one where if you kind of try to just reword it or move things around, it's not going to work, right? Because there's no patel as a noun. There's only patel as an adjective, patel socks. So you might say something like, after working in the yard for many hours, Patel realized his socks were drenched in sweat, or something like that. It's going to be a little bit trickier to reword it. And you could see something like this on the SAT or SAT, where there's different words being added in, simply because you can't just eloquently reword something like this, because of the way that it's presented in the first place. So this is another dangling modifier, because the socks were not working in the yard. And then on your standardized test, you'll have multiple options. So if you saw Patel socks in another choice B, for example, then you would know, oh, hey, it's not Patel socks. I can just cross it off. It doesn't matter what it says after Patel socks, because I know it has to say Patel. Okay, you are very welcome. And the next one, covered in dust after sitting in the attic for months, the suitcase looked much older than it was. Okay, so what's the modifying phrase? We've got covered in dust after sitting in the attic for months. And what is it modifying? Oh, it's modifying the suitcase. So in this case, we're good. This is a lot of words happening, covered in the dust after sitting in the attic for months, but it's the suitcase that we're talking about. So this one is the only one that's actually correct here. I'll just put little X's in case anybody missed the first couple of explanations here. And number 4 is a past participle. So again, you have here present participle with having, past participle with covered, and you've got just different situations going on. So as long as you practice and know what to identify, and knowing that you have modifiers, you'll be in pretty good shape. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them in now. If not, we are going to wrap up for now. Just remember to review everything and you will be okay. Look for modifiers everywhere there, all around you. They are very often misused. So see if you can find in your everyday life, see if you can find something that you're reading and has a misplaced error. I bet you can, and try and fix it. Right, so if nobody has any questions, I will see you all next time. Thanks for tuning in.